In the comments section of a previous video, Notes for Red October, it was suggested I make a video on the subject of legendary swords. I had not thought to explore the subject before. It wasn't one in which I had, or have, any expertise, and I nearly passed on the idea. But then I reconsidered. The comment was well informed and detailed, and certain swords were suggested. Here then follows 3 swords of legend: Graham, Durandal, and Excalibur. I must warn you, I am not an expert. I am no Chadversity, but hopefully you will like this video enough not to hate it. From Norse heroic tradition comes the legendary sword Graham, gift of the god Odin. It became the family sword of the Volsungs and is written about in the Volsunga Saga, an epic saga of the late 13th century with origins as far back as the 5th century. But Graham also appears in other tales, such as the Nibelungenlied, where it is called Balmog, and in the opera The Ring of the Nibelung by Wagner it is called Notherling. Like most legendary swords, it is strong, capable of cutting through iron. Its first incarnation is as the sword of Sigmund, Sigurd's father, and it arrives somewhat miraculously during the wedding feast of Signy, Sigmund's sister. A certain man came into the hall, unknown of aspect to all men, and such like array he had, that over him was a spotted cloak, and he was barefoot, and had linen breeches knit tight even unto the bone, and he had a sword in his hand, as he went up to the brandstock, and a slouched hat upon his head. Huge he was, and seeming ancient, and one-eyed. So he drew his sword, and smote it into the tree trunk, so that it sank in up to the hilts, and all held back from greeting the man. Then he took up the word and said, Whoso draweth this sword from this stock shall have the same as a gift from me, and shall find in good sooth that never bare he better sword in hand than this is. Therewith out went the old man from the hall, and none knew who he was, or whither he went. The old man is the god Odin, and of course all the men in the hall attempt to pull the sword from the tree. But in a moment reminiscent of Excalibur, only the son of King Volsung, Sigmund, is worthy enough. After betrayals and battles, Odin himself breaks the sword. From the shards, the smith Regan forges Graham for Sigmund's son, Sigurd. As he bore it forth from the forge, it seemed to the smiths as though fire burned among the edges thereof. Now he bade Sigurd take the sword, and said he knew not how to make a sword if this one failed. Then Sigurd smote it into the anvil, and cleft it down to the stock thereof, and neither burst the sword nor break it. Ironically, after Sigurd has killed the dragon Fafnir, it is with this sword that Sigurd takes off Regan's head. It later becomes a symbol of chastity. Brunhild puts it between herself and the dead Sigurd on their funeral pyre. Roland was the hero of French medieval romance, and is the subject of both the 11th century anonymous epic poem The Song of Roland and the Italian epic Orlando Furioso, penned by Ludovico Ariosto. Incidentally, The name Roland meant famous land in Old French and German, and was introduced into England by the Normans, where it developed into a number of English surnames, such as Roland, Roland, and Rowlands. In the 11th century French poem, Durandal came to Roland via the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, who received it from an angel with the instruction to gift it to one of his 12 peers. Ludovico Ariosto followed an earlier writer, Boiardo, in claiming the sword was once that of the Trojan prince Hector. So, not a good sign then. Nor sword nor club the warlike Tartar bore, since when the Trojan Hector's plate and chain he gained, because the Volsunga lacked, he swore, to this obliged, nor swore the king in vain, that he save he won the blade Orlando wore. He would no other grasp than Durandal, held in high value by Almontes bold, which Roland bears, and Hector bore of old. A poem from the 12th century, Aspremont, has a young Roland coming to the aid of Charlemagne during a battle with Armon, son of the African Saracen king Agolant. It is Armon who wields Durandal, and Roland defeats him, taking his sword. In the Song of Roland, the hilt is described as containing a number of holy relics, which, if we take figuratively, reinforces the Christian iconography of the poem. Durandal, most holy, fair indeed, relics enough thy golden hilt conceals. St. Peter's tooth, the blood of St. Basil, some of the hairs of my lord St. Denis, some of the robe was worn by St. Mary. It is not right that pagans should these seize. For Christian men your use shall ever be. The sword is also described as being indestructible. Realizing defeat is inevitable, Roland warns Charlemagne by blowing on his horn, a type of horn known as an oliphant, associated in the medieval mind with elephants, and possibly where Tolkien got the word for his Lord of the Rings. Roland then makes a vain attempt to destroy Durandal. Then Roland feels he has lost his sight, climbs to his feet, uses what strength he might. In all his face the colour is grown white. In front of him a great brown boulder lies, whereupon 10 blows with grief and rage he strikes. The steel cries out, but does not break outright. And the Count says, St. Mary be my guide. Good Durandal, unlucky is your plight, I've need of you no more. Spent is my pride. We in the field have won so many fights, combating through so many regions wide, that Charles holds, whose beard is hoary white. Be you not his that turns from any in flight. A good vassal held you this long time, never shall France the free behold his like. Roland hath struck the Sardonyx terrace. The steel cries out, but broken is no ways. So when he sees he never can it break, within himself begins he to complain. Ah, Durandal, white thou art, clear of stain, beneath the sun reflecting back his rays. In Moraine was Charles in the vale, when from heaven God sent his angel, bade him give thee to a count and capitan. Girt thee on me, that noble king and great. Roland his stroke on a dark stone repeats, and more of it breaks off than I can speak. The sword cries out, yet breaks not in the least. Back from the blow into the air it leaps. In answer to this problem, Roland is said to have hidden Durandal under his own body. The battle in which Roland is engaged in the poem is that of the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, 778 AD. It is not a fictional battle, and Roland himself seems to have been based on a real man, a Frankish military governor loyal to Charlemagne. He was part of the rear guard, which was ambushed by Basque forces as Charlemagne's army made their return to France over the Pyrenees after his expedition into Muslim-occupied Spain. The name Durandal has within it the concept of hardness and strength. The French stem, dur, for example, starts the name and is echoed by the English word endurance. It has been suggested the name can be deconstructed into Durant Dale, or strong scythe, possibly even enduring scimitar or scythe, which brings to mind the assertion in the 12th century poem Aspremont that Durandal was originally the sword of a Saracen prince. Perhaps, if Durandal had been real, or at least based on a real sword, it might have carried a curving blade. Whatever its actual appearance, it is recreated here with the appearance of the undoubted replica embedded in a cliff face in Rocamadour, which is chained so no one can steal it. The sword holds a curious position in the imagination. Speaking practically, it is a sharp object designed to kill one's opponents in combat. Yet it has come to represent ideas and concepts. It has symbolic value beyond mere warfare. In Christianity, the Archangel Michael is armed with a sword as a symbol of justice, truth, and purity. In tarot, the meaning of the sword lies with intellect and the mind. In the cases of both Graham and Durandal, the swords speak of divine selection and martial prowess. Sigmund and Roland are chosen by a god to wield them. Odin in the Volsunga Saga, God in his instructions given to Charlemagne via messenger. The sword in the stone can only be pulled out by the one selected to be King of England by Jesus Christ, and so it is associated with power and authority. It means kingship. In The Lord of the Rings, the sword that was broken is remade. It heralds the return of the king to Gondor. The phallic symbolism of the sword has not been lost on generations of writers. The king as sword wielder and the queen as cup-bearer are motifs common in art and literature, and the symbolism is clear. For the more salacious, the sword is a source of wit. In Henry IV Part 2, William Shakespeare has Mistress Quickly say, "In good faith, there cares not what mischief he does, if his weapon be out." The world of Falstaff is full of double meanings. There drew he forth the brand Excalibur, and o'er him, drawing it, the winter moon, brightening the skirts of a long cloud, ran forth, and sparkled keen with frosts against the hilt. For all the haft twinkled with diamond sparks, myriads of topaz lights and jacinth work of subtlest jewellery. There are few swords that come to mind more quickly than the sword of King Arthur, Excalibur. The foremost object of Arthuriana, its name is associated with medieval romance and kingship. But the legend of King Arthur and his sword is older than the Middle Ages, and has its origins in the Dark Ages and the passing of Romano-British society. For example, the association of Excalibur with the Lady in the Lake brings to mind the ancient Celtic tradition of casting precious items, such as swords and brooches, into lakes, a tradition that survives today as the custom of casting coins into wishing wells. In the 12th century Historia Regum Britannia, Geoffrey of Monmouth calls the sword of Arthur Caliburn. It appears in Book 9. Before the city known today as Lincoln, Arthur prepares for battle. Girding on his Caliburn, which was an excellent sword made in the Isle of Avalon, he graced his right hand with his lance, named Ron, which was hard, broad, and fit for slaughter. In the anonymous 11th century tale, Coleridge and Olwen, the sword of Arthur has the Welsh name Caledfalich. Then said Arthur, "Since thou wilt not remain here, chieftain, thou shalt receive the boon, whatsoever thy tongue may name, as far as the wind dries, and the rain moistens, and the sun revolves, and the sea encircles, and the earth extends, save only my ship, and my mantle, and Caledfalich, my sword." This echoes the name in Cornish, Caledfol, and Breton, Caledvolich, and all three languages have close links to the language of the ancient Britons. It is also very similar to Excalibur, making the amateur detective wonder if the addition of X is significant. It is a Latin prefix meaning out of, from, or formerly, as in exit, exhume, and exclude. It brings to mind the legend of the sword in the stone, which may or may not be Excalibur. The earliest telling of the sword in the stone was in a French 12th or 13th century poem, now mostly lost. It was written by Robert de Boron and is called Merlin. The influence of Geoffrey of Monmouth is abundant, and the poem itself served as a source for the Thomas Malory epic Le Morte d'Arthur. Merlin was translated into English, and in its mid-15th century form, the motif is described as follows. Some of the people yede out of the church, where there was a void place, and when they come out of the church, they saw it gain door and clear, and saw before the church door a great stone 4 square, and they knew of what stone it was. But some said it was marble, and above, in the middle place of this stone, there stood a scythe of iron that was largely half a foot of height, and through this stithy was a sword fixed into the stone. When they see this, that first one come out of the church, they had great marvel, and yet again into the church and told the archbishop. And when the good man had sang mass heard this, he took howly water and cast upon the stith, and the archbishop loaded to the sword, and saw letters of gold in the steel, and he read the letters that saiden, "Who taketh this sword out of the stone should be king by the election of Jesu Christ." And when he had read this letters, he said to the people what it meant. The motive of a sword partly encased in stone occurs in chapter 3 of the Volsunga Saga, and perhaps this is the origin of the similar episode in Merlin. Be that as it may, the sword's removal from the stone signifies the divine approval for whomever has pulled it out to be king, this being young Arthur, and we have the association of a divine mandate to rule with a sword. The sword as a symbol of authority, which continues to this day in Great Britain as part of a monarch's coronation. There is an ancient Roman angle in all this. If King Arthur is a real historical figure of the Dark Ages, then he would probably have been a British chieftain during the collapse of Romano-British society, a world of mighty ruins, invading Germans, ancient gods, and sketchy records. All a bit Lord of the Rings-like, with its ruins, empty lands, orcs, and ancient lore. If Arthur had a sword, then it would not have been the elegant broadsword of medieval romance, but a Roman sword, a spatha, double-edged, relatively short, and with a narrower crossguard. There is a 12th century poem called The Dream of Roland that describes Excalibur as having twin chimeras, or serpents, on its hilt. When the sword was unsheathed, what was seen from the mouths of the two chimeras was like two flames of fire so dreadful it was not easy for anyone to behold. It may have been a motif of the Welsh kingdom of Powys, and was certainly used as an insignia of the 4th century Roman emperor Magnus Maximus, who commanded the Roman army in Britain before marching on Rome. In his 1996 book, The Search for the Grail, called The Chalice of Magdalene in the US, Graham Phillips suggests that the real Arthur was a descendant of Magnus Maximus. This links the concept of the sword to Roman imperial power. So, we have looked at 3 legendary swords: Gram, Durandal, and Excalibur. It has been somewhat of a whistle-stop tour, and one video cannot hope to go into great depth. The subject of the sword as symbol is a broad one. There is something to be said about the sword representing, somewhat ironically, fertility as a phallic symbol, and a continuity of family over the generations. Gram, for example, is passed from Sigmund to Sigurd. The task of mending the mistake of Isildur is passed on to his descendant Aragorn, both literally and metaphorically, through the shards of Narsil. Gram, Durandal, and Excalibur are only 3 swords, and perhaps we will never know if they really existed. There are many other swords, and perhaps we will explore their stories at some later date. But for now, I hope you have enjoyed this video.